Stand by. We're going live. We're going live. 10, 9, going live. 7, 6, 5, going live. 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hey there, everyone. Welcome to 10 Seconds to Air. I'm Alita Guillen. Today's podcast is about writing. Writing is a form of communication. It actually helps improve your nonverbal and verbal connections with other people. And when you write well, you make a reader feel something. Maybe you've thought about writing a memoir or a fiction book, but you just don't do it. I get it. It's intimidating. Where do you begin? How do you make readers feel something? And then how do you get to the masses once you're done? Well, today's guest is going to help us answer all of those questions and tell us how she communicates through her writing. Janis Cooke Newman is an author and teacher. Her books include Mary, Mrs. A. Lincoln, A Master Plan for Rescue, and a memoir, The Russian Word for Snow. She is the founder of the Lit Camp Writers Conference and the founder of Page Street, a co-working space for writers in San Francisco and Berkeley. It's a really cool space. I can't wait for her to tell you more about that. I met her at a writing and meditation retreat that I attended last fall. I found how she guided my group through the process of observing the world around us and then expressing that through story was exceptional. So I thought it would be fun to share her with all of you. Janis Cooke Newman joins me now to talk about communicating through writing. Hi, Janis. How are you?
I'm good. It's so nice to see you again.
So good to see you again. Thanks for doing this. I think you just came off leading another workshop retreat, right?
I did. I just spent all of last week at Esalen with another writing and mindfulness group.
So you must be in a very good mental space right now. Or maybe not. Maybe you need a break.
No, I think it's good. And I think this is timed well because everything is fresh in my mind that I've just taught them.
Okay, perfect. Well, before I start with the first question that I ask everyone, I want to start with establishing the difference between an author and a writer, which you brought up in my group. It was the first question that you asked my group, and we didn't really know the difference. When you said it, it was an aha, but I want you to say it for everyone here. What is the difference between an author and a writer?
So being a writer is something you decide for yourself. People who have an urge to write, who like to write, no one is making them write. And it can really take the form of journaling, all the way, poetry, maybe all the way through working on a memoir or a novel. Becoming an author is something somebody else decides. An agent, a publisher. And I think that so many people are afraid to say, I am a writer because they haven't done a book yet, or they haven't been published somewhere. And I think that's unfair. I think we get to decide if we are writers. And to some extent, everyone is a writer because we all communicate using the written language.
Right.
So I don't like to give that power to the publishing houses to determine what you are.
So we're all writers, but the author is published.
Exactly. So, and ultimately, though, the author is still a writer at heart, and the author is a writer. The world sees them as an author.
Okay, so we're going to work through how one might go from writer to author with you. I'm excited about that. But first, let me ask you the first question. What goes through your mind 10 seconds to air? And that could be for you, what goes through your mind before you sit down and write or before you lead one of these workshops?
That's such a good question. I think that what goes through my mind is this: I hope I say something useful. I think about it before we begin the workshop, seeing everyone and finding out what their expectations are. But it's very similar to when you sit down to write. So I'm glad you asked that part of it. Because when you sit down to write, you are the least important person in the room. Your reader is the most important person in the room. And what you can make them feel and think about and maybe re-examine, that's your role. And so I always try to have that in mind when I begin any of these things is how can what I say or write be useful for the people I'm saying it to.
I mean, how do you make it useful for the people that you're saying it to or writing for?
That's the question.
That's where I stop. I go, how can I make use of? You know what? I can't. Forget about it. No, but you clearly can. So how do you make it useful, or how can you make it useful? And by the way, can I just say, I sat in one of your workshops. You make it very useful. So in case there was any confusion there, everything that came out of your mouth was incredibly useful for me. So there, for whatever it's worth.
Thank you for saying that. Part of what in the workshops is why I write to everybody ahead of time. I think it's important when you're doing a workshop like this, where people are going to be vulnerable, they're going to share their writing, they're going to come and devote a fair amount of time to do this. You need to know who's in the room. You need to know, do people identify as writers? Do they identify as meditators? And what are their expectations? What are they hoping to get out of the workshop? Mm-hmm. You know, there are things I like to talk about, especially about writing, but maybe they're not right for this group. So with this workshop, I always tweak it a little for the folks that are there. So as I recall, the one you were in had a lot of writers in it. And so I leaned more heavily on that side because that's what people were looking for. The one I've just concluded had many more people who were just writing for themselves, did not have an intention to write for other people, although I think some of them might have changed their minds by the end. And so I make sure that the information I'm giving them suits what their intentions are.
Mm-hmm. How did you get into writing? You didn't start off as a writer, right? It came to you later?
It did come to me later, but I always wanted to be a writer, even when I was like a small child. And I remember thinking, I can do this in the 5th grade when I won an essay contest on bicycle safety, and I didn't know how to ride a bike.
Okay.
I thought fiction is for me.
That definitely gives you a little bit of oomph. So you wrote about bicycle safety, but you didn't even ride a bike. So where did you get the information or the feeling to write that?
My imagination, where so much of my writing comes from.
Yeah.
But no, I did not work as a writer right away. And I did not study writing in college because I was concerned, will I make a living? Which is no small concern when you're thinking about writing as a career. And I went into psychology, which actually has helped me, I think, as a fiction writer. I started to go back to it in probably the late 1980s. I was writing corporate comedy.
Corporate comedy? Do those even go together? Are they supposed to go together? What is corporate comedy?
So we did this. I had a business with my husband at the time. And what we did was, let's say a tech company or an investment company wanted to take their top salespeople to Hawaii to reward them. We would go in and research about what made their job hard, who were their enemies, who were their allies, stuff about flamboyant individuals in the company. And then we would take that research and write what was in format like a Saturday Night Live show with sketches and song parodies, except all the jokes were about them. And then we'd cast it, rehearse it, and it would be like a show that would open and close on the same night. We'd go and do that.
Oh, what fun.
It was really fun. And I think I learned a lot about the writing I eventually went on to do. So when I say I'm the least important person in the room, I learned that writing for an audience, because you know right away if a joke you have written is landed and people are laughing, or if it has fallen flat. So that made me very aware of my audience. What finally got me into writing books is after I adopted my son. So I adopted my son from a Moscow orphanage in 1996. And I was home with him. And I kept thinking, there just doesn't exist the book I wished had existed when I was going through the process. There are books about how to do an international adoption. There are books that I think, are not entirely honest, or it's like, everything was great. It was the happiest day of my life. And I thought, no, this is an emotional roller coaster, particularly international adoption. And that is what made me decide to write a book, which was kind of bold because I had published exactly nothing before I had this idea.
Yeah. So when you set out to write that book, did you have an idea of how you're going to market it to the masses? Or did you feel like this is a passion project? I'm just going to write it because it's inside me and I don't know what's going to happen with it.
I felt pretty confident about getting it out there, maybe naively confident. But, it was a time when Memoir was extremely popular. And Russian adoption was extremely popular. So I knew there was an audience. What helped me was that I went to a conference. I shared some of the pages, early pages, with an agent, and she sold it before I was done.
Oh, wow.
Because, what surprised me, but the publisher, I think, understood that there would be an audience for this. There's a lot of pros and cons to this. It's wonderful to know your book will go out in the world. It's also terrifying because you have a deadline. And I spent months waking up in the middle of the night thinking, oh my God, everyone's going to know I'm a fraud. I don't know how to do this.
That's what you were thinking. They're going to know I'm a fraud as a writer. Interesting.
Yeah, but I did
Wow.
get it done. And it's still remarkably in print. Considering that Russian adoption has been closed for a very long time. So that's very gratifying.
So how long did it take you to write that first book?
Well, I only had a year, so I had to do it in a year. I think I was new enough to realize that writers miss these deadlines all the time.
Oh.
And that they don't come and put you in jail if you do. I learned this on my second book, where I missed the deadline by 2 years.
Well, wait. You missed the deadline by 2 years?
Yes.
That's a lot.
Yeah, it was the novel about Mary Todd Lincoln. And I knew I couldn't do it in a year. And my agent kept saying, no, you're going to have to do it in a year. And I was like, no, I can't. And we're talking about a book that ended up being 650 pages. This woman had a big life.
Yeah.
And it took me 3 years. And probably if I had not had any deadlines, it would have taken me twice as long.
What took so long with that book?
There was just a lot of writing to do. And also, I was learning how to write fiction because my previous book was a memoir. My other writing, I'd been a travel writer, so it was all nonfiction writing.
Mm-hmm.
This book was teaching me how to write a novel. I had the fortune of having somebody's real life, a really interesting life, and a great character to work with, but I was fictionalizing it. And so within those boundaries, I learned how to write fiction. So that did take a little while for me to kind of ease into that. Plus, writing a novel takes a long time. My third one, where it was not sold ahead of time, that took 7 years.
Wow. And is that pretty normal? Those the normal timelines?
Yes. I have friends who have taken 10 years or more. Some people can crank something out in a year or two. I envy them. But sometimes I think it takes me the whole first year to figure out who my characters are.
Yeah.
And then you're always writing and rewriting and coming up with a story. And with fiction, I think you have to take some meandering paths until you can figure out exactly what it is you want to say.
So you said you were teaching yourself or learning fiction writing. Let's fast forward that learning track for people who are listening. What are the fundamentals that you can identify about fiction writing?
Well, I think a lot of it, and I talk about this in my workshops a lot, is that a story is really, and this is true about memoir too, a story is really about what a character wants, whether that character is you or an invented character, what they're willing to do to get it, why they want it, and then eventually what they learn over the course of your book. Jane Smiley says in 13 Ways of Looking at the Novel that a climax in a book is an emotional climax. It is the point in a book where the character learns what it is they have to learn. This basic formula of, knowing what the character wants and what the character has to learn, I think will always help you in terms of finding your plot and a structure. And plot and structure are one of the hardest things to find in memoir, for sure. And they're a little hard to find in a novel as well. So for me, because I'm an outliner, I always ask myself those two questions before I even start writing. What does my character want, and what does my character have to learn? And I think learning that was the biggest thing for me. I mean, there's lots of other craft things you can talk about, but that was the main thing.
And you set that out at the beginning before you start writing. You think really hard about that.
I do. I think really hard about it. When I was doing the Mary Lincoln book, I read biographies of her, and I had to stop and think, okay, this is a woman who on the surface does a lot of things that seem crazy. Okay, she was a shopaholic. She probably had an affair in the White House, and let's face it, who cheats on the great emancipator? But I think she did. She practiced spiritualism. And so, and she overspent redecorating the White House. So I spent a lot of time thinking, why? Why did she do these things? What was she hoping to gain by doing all these things? And what I eventually settled on was that she really had an obsessive need for love and attention. Everything she did was to make other people love her. And then, of course, if that's her desire, what she has to learn is that you cannot make people love you. No matter how hard you try, you cannot force someone to love you. And that really helped me find my way through that book.
And how much of that process, so what she needs to learn and then what she does learn, do you think about your audience and say, what will my audience believe, or what does my audience need? This is what she needs, but what does my audience need?
That's a good question. And ultimately, what you want from your audience is for them to root for your character. So this does not mean make your character perfect, because if your character is perfect, no one's going to root for them because we can't identify with people who are perfect. So really, you want your characters to be deeply flawed. So Mary Lincoln was a gift, really, for a new fiction writer because she had many flaws. I fell in love with her, but she also had many, many flaws. So I don't know if I could have invented such a great character. But in the end, the character has to have enough vulnerability, and you have to make it clear why they do what they do so that the reader can have some empathy with them, can identify with them, and ultimately root for them. Because if a reader is not rooting for your main character, they're not going to be interested in your book. Mm-hmm. So you really have to work at that. And when I talk about this with my students, I actually talk a lot about the TV show Breaking Bad, because here was a character who does a lot of bad things and lots of things that are unlikable, and yet you root for him in every scene.
So why did we root for him? Break that down. I mean, I remember I loved that show and I did root for him, but I didn't know why I was rooting for him, I guess. I was just a viewer.
I think because of his vulnerabilities. We go back to why he begins to do what he does, and he has cancer and he is trying to get money for his treatment. And then he has a family, and we see him with his family and his care for the family. And even though each season, the things he does get worse, we've now been established and we are following and tracking that journey. And every bad decision he makes, we understand it. Even if we're saying, that's a really bad decision, but I see why you did that, so that we continue to root for him. maybe when the show goes off, we're like, oh my God, I was rooting for him to kill this person.
Yeah. Yeah.
I can't believe I did that. But it's a testament to the writing of that show.
And maybe this is too much detail in the craft, but do you establish the good side before you establish what they need? When do you bring in the pieces you need to have the audience root for them?
I think the first thing you do is establish the character, really making a mess of their life. It's so useful to begin a story with a character who is just screwing up right from the start because of this thing they need to learn. Because first of all, that makes us, that says, oh yeah, I see that. I see what you're doing here. So we begin to identify with them. And it draws us in. It makes us think, okay, this is a pretty interesting story. The Mary Lincoln book begins while she is in the lunatic asylum, that her eldest and only surviving son has placed her. So she's not really having a good time in her life when we first
Right.
pop in.
And that's gripping. That's at a moment that's really gripping as for an audience.
It is. There's a really good book on writing called Save the Cat Writes a Novel. And it originally was, there's a book, the first book was Save the Cat Writes a Screenplay. And the whole premise is if you have, a bad guy or an antagonist, you have them do something admirable, like save a cat from a burning building, so that they're not all bad. Because people aren't all bad or all flawed.
Wow. You don't think about that, though, when you're an audience, I guess. And then even I took the class and that really opened my eyes to think, oh, okay, you don't want this character, your main character, to be all good. Nobody's all good. You can't root for somebody who's all good. It doesn't exist. It's not real. And I think I remember you saying something about then your audience won't trust you.
Yes, they will not trust that this is a real person. And audience trust is huge. I'm glad you brought it up. It's a very big part. It's why you always try not to tell the audience what to think. You might be writing a memoir about your mother who was truly a horrible person, but you don't want, to say that. You don't want to say in your book, my mother was a horrible person, because the reader will doubt you. So you want to show this. You want to show what the mother was doing. That makes the author think that.
Wow, so interesting. So, Janice, I want to move to something that I think you do that I found really special in the workshop, and it's that you combine meditation with writing. Why do you do that? Where did that originate?
Well, it originated from my own experience. I have been a writer much longer than I have been a meditator. But about, I'm going to say 6 or 7 years ago, when I began to have a really consistent meditation practice, I noticed a change both in my writing and in my approach to writing. And so I wanted to spend some time exploring why that was, why the two practices were feeding each other. And I think it's probably not surprising. We now know from science that a consistent meditation practice changes your brain for the better.
Mm-hmm.
So you have an increased ability to concentrate. It tends to increase the decision-making parts of the brain. So that was really helpful. But I also noticed, along with meditation comes a lot of mindfulness practices. And I began to see that, as writers, our job is to render the world on the page. And if you are not paying attention to the world, how are you going to get it down on the page with any authenticity? So I remember I used to always write, if I had to write the dawn, I would make it silvery. And then I finally got up early enough to see dawn. It's not silver at all. No, it's pink. And I thought,
Yeah.
right, we need a mindfulness practice to help us do that. And then there are other practices that come out of the meditation, like a body scan, which many, many people have done. That is invaluable for writers because you really need to write from your characters' bodies. And I think so often as writers, we live in our heads And so our characters feel like eyeballs and brains going through the world, but very disconnected from their bodies.
Yeah.
But think about this. If you read She Picked Up the Teacup versus she felt the warmth of the teacup in her fingers. Notice how the second one brings you so much closer to the character.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is another way we establish empathy with the characters and also get the audience to root for them.
Wow, I remember some of the exercises that you had us do when it was to close our eyes and really listen to what's happening around us, to go outside and to just listen. And we don't do that. We walk outside and we look around and we get into our car and then we go and but we don't really look around and feel all of that. So it was an amazing exercise for me. And, I wish I could do more of it, but I am trying to practice a little bit. But it really did give me an idea that, wow. And so when I'm reading now, when I'm writing also, but I read more than I write, I really am paying attention to the feeling and what's going on with the characters, and how that writer and author is allowing me such a close look, an intimate look at the characters. The book that I can think of is it Demon Copperhead?
Oh, yes. Wonderful book.
Demon Copperhead, right?
Yes.
That was an incredible book. I think I started it during the workshop, and she really gets into that main character who is extremely flawed and has a very difficult life, but you do root for him the whole time, and you get really close to him because you feel what's in his body. Talks about drug addiction and you feel what's in his body, whether you've experienced any of that or not. And I think that's kind of the key, whether you're there or you've experienced that moment looking at the stars. Maybe you haven't been able to do that, but if the writer is really there and can bring you there with feeling, that's really powerful.
Yeah, and I think what Barbara Kingsolver does in that book is really remarkable because she inhabits the psyche and the body of someone very different from herself. And she writes so well about addiction and the rush of the high and why it's so hard to give up, which is not something she experienced. She's talked to people, but then there's that next step where you as the writer have to put somebody else's experience in your body and then translate what you feel, all those sensations, onto the page.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a real tour de force to be able to do that.
What do you think about writers' groups and having a writing partner?
I think they're invaluable if you have the right people. So I have always had a fairly small writing group for all of my books. I usually put the group together after the first draft because sometimes I think I will be sidetracked. Although with my first two books, I did it right away because I was still learning, and getting the feedback from the people in the group was really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
I'm currently working on a new novel and I have a writing partner. This is someone who was from one of my groups when I was working on the Mary Lincoln book. And she's been with me through the whole time. And we meet via Zoom every 2 weeks. We send each other work. We meet via Zoom and we talk about it. And the beauty of her as a partner is that our strengths and weaknesses dovetail. So I'm very good at plot. She is very good at character. And so we really help each other out. But I also say you have to be really careful. The people in your writing group, they shouldn't always be only praising you, but you have to leave the group eager to get back to your work. And sometimes it's the way somebody critiques your work. I once had somebody in a writing group where it was just her expression when she talked about my work that I couldn't actually hear anything she was saying. But there are sometimes you're in a group and you leave and you think, why am I doing this? I shouldn't be doing this. I can't do this. Then you should just run from that group.
Yeah, because I think one of the things you could do is be thinking, oh, it's because I don't want to write, or I'm pushing off. And you say, don't overthink that. If you're not feeling it, move on. There's going to be another group out there for you.
Yes, exactly. And I'm also a big believer in writing in community. So I got through a lot of COVID. Almost every day, myself and 5 other writer friends, we would get on Zoom. We would set intentions. We'd turn off our microphones, but leave the cameras on. And we would write for 90 minutes together.
Oh.
We called it surveillance writing because we could see each other. So, like, if you walked away, other people knew. And at the end, we would regroup and sometimes read to each other. And it was so helpful to be in that group. And I really like being in the same physical space with other writers, which is why I started those co-working spaces.
Oh, those sound wonderful. Describe them. What happens in those co-working spaces?
So both of them are made. In fact, the first one we got was a cafe. So they're made to look like a cafe because people like to go write in cafes. What you don't like about writing in a cafe may be it's noisy, or you don't want to leave your computer on your table when you use the restroom, or there's a barista giving you side eye if you're not ordering enough cappuccinos.
It seems to me like you've written in these cafes before, Janice.
I have indeed. And so we created it's like a private membership cafe. So the door's locked. Members can come and go as they please. They open it with an app on their phone. You come in, you take a seat wherever. We have a silent rule, except for at lunch, where we gather around a big table and have lunch together and chat for like 45 minutes, which is great. In the kitchen, we put in a cappuccino machine, electric tea kettle, microwave, and we provide coffee and tea. So you can make your own coffee and tea.
Wow. Dreamy. It sounds wonderful.
It is dreamy. There's a thing, like if you've ever meditated in a zendo or in a space with other people who are meditating, it's so different than when you are just home alone sitting on your cushion. It is easier when you're surrounded by all those people with the same intention. And the same holds true for writing. It kind of keeps you honest because everyone else is writing, so you're writing. And there's an energy, I think, that's created when you have a group of people.
Yeah. So if you don't have that group of people and you want to get started, and maybe you will get there, you will get to that group of people. But if you want to get started, what's your advice to get started?
Well, there's a couple things you can do. If you have friends who are also writers or maybe trying to write, I, for a long time, used to run a thing called the Roast Chicken Writers Club, where I would invite my writer friends to my house on a Sunday afternoon, and we would write together in my house while I roasted a chicken.
Okay.
And they would bring things. And, after 2 hours of writing together, we'd open the wine and we would have dinner together, and it would be really fun. So it's very easy if you know other people and you can meet those people in writing classes and at bookstores, and you put that together. If your friends are not local, you can do a thing like we did during COVID, the surveillance writing, where you write together on Zoom. It's a little different than being in person, but it's very effective. It's more effective than being on your own.
What is your daily practice?
I am a huge believer in writing first thing in the morning. There is science behind this. When we first wake up, we're closer to the dream state. Our brains are they're more flexible. It's easier to make connections between things, which I think is at the heart of creativity, this ability to make connections. Your internal sensor is also not as strong when you first wake up.
So what does that mean?
That means, that part of your brain that's always criticizing you. And
okay.
That's a lousy sentence and that's not the right word. And
I know that person, Janice. I know that person. Talks to me all the time. Delete.
I think we all do. So I actually generate all of my new material in 10-minute bursts of free writing first thing in the morning. And what I will do is at night, I'll plant the seed. I'll think about what scene I need to write next in my book or what character motivation I might be having trouble with. And then as soon as I wake up in the morning, I try not to think about anything else. And I sit down at the computer and I set a timer and I just free write for 10 minutes. And I'm going to say it's sometimes surprising what comes up. But once I know that character, it fits and everything.
Okay.
And that's a practice I do every day, 7 days a week. I think it's vital.
10 minutes. You wake up and you do 10 minutes. Okay.
If I'm on a roll, I might go 15, but 10. I meditate after that. I do know some people who meditate first because they want to clear their heads. So you kind of have to find what works for you. Then later, like I'm a morning writer. So after breakfast, I will sit down to do what I think of as my regular writing. But I have that sort of raw material I've generated in the free write in the morning. So it's like a sculptor having some clay.
Okay.
And I work that and I try to figure out what's going on with that. And I spend a few hours doing that. If I'm on writing retreat, I'll write in the afternoon, but most of the time unless I'm in final revisions, in the afternoon, I have to do something else. I answer emails and do more business type stuff. But that is sort of my process.
I love the 10 minutes of writing, the free writing in the morning, whether it's just a free write that's about nothing that you plan on publishing, but it's something that you get out, or it's around what you are working on, the project that you're working on. My struggle always is that I want to edit that, or I want to go back and edit that, and that never seems to work well for me, or I might not use it. So I'm worried that I'm writing things, and I'm wondering if that happens to you. I'm writing for the sake of writing, which to me sounds like it's a good thing, but I have this struggle with, I want it to be poetic when I write it, or I want to make sure I use that. Do you use everything that you write, or are there times that you toss things?
Oh my God, no, I don't use everything I write. Sometimes it's like a whole week of, well, none of that was usable. But you have to remember, writing is a practice, the way meditation is a practice. This is another way they dovetail. So sometimes people will sit down and for their meditation, and then their mind has gone elsewhere for the entire time, and the bell rings, and they're like, oh, that was a bad meditation. Okay, it's never a bad meditation as long as you did it. The only way it's a bad meditation if you didn't do it. A monkey mind on a particular day, that's what's there that day. And it's the same thing with writing. Writing is a practice, and you are working that writing muscle. And some days what is there is not going to be usable. But I always tell myself, well, I got to get all this bad writing out before I can get to the good writing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's true. Sometimes you just have to get something out to access what comes next.
Yeah, exactly. So I think the idea of considering your writing like a practice.
Yeah.
I think it relieves some of that. But, those of us who are very goal oriented, it takes a while to get there. Right. Because we do want everything we write to be, oh, this is perfect. I'm just going to plug this right in.
Right. Do you ever have writer's block? Is that a thing?
I get stuck. I did in my last novel have a little bit of writer's block. And I did a little in this one too, but I notice when it happens, it's mostly because there's something wrong with what I'm writing about.
Interesting. Okay.
It's usually, for me, that I am we call it protecting the character. I am not letting anything bad happen to my character. I am not letting my character make a really bad decision. This is extremely common among writers because we sort of fall in love with our characters.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah, and we have to remember, we have to let bad things happen to them, and they have to make bad decisions. And Charles Baxter talks in the book, The Art of Subtext, your character must have unthinkable thoughts. And sometimes we are afraid we're thinking, oh, if I give my character this really unthinkable thought, people will think I have it. The thing is,
That's not
we
true.
all have them. We all have unthinkable thoughts. So there's no point hiding. And so really what happens is writer's block for me is that I've gotten bored with my own story.
Oh, okay.
And I have to take a step back and see, okay, how do I spice this up? And
Oh.
the problem is almost always I'm protecting my character.
And I remember you saying something about memoir versus fiction writing. And I think when we come out, let's say we're going to write a memoir, everybody says, I've got a story inside me, or you should see my family, or, whatever. We've all got that, right? This relative or whatever. When you write that, what I liked, one of the things that you said, I thought, you can write it as a memoir, but it could be fiction. You can almost take liberties. I know I wrote an exercise that I started to write in that memoir voice, but I took a lot of liberties, like what I thought those people might do if we let them. And I thought that was interesting. Do you ever write like that, where you're writing, it's almost truth or memoir like, but it's your fiction?
Good question. I think,
or what do you think about that for, that practice, doing it like that?
I think whatever gets you to put words on the page, number one, is good. I think to some extent we are all writing ourselves when we are writing fiction, because we have to figure out, like Barbara Kingsolver, what would getting high feel like in her body? What would trying to stop taking painkillers feel like in her body? You have to approach a lot of it from your own human experience. And I think that's also why, at its heart, we're all writing the same book over and over again. We're all dealing with the same things. But you raise an interesting point that I think about in terms of memoir, is that in memoir, to really write a memoir, you must impose an artificial structure on your life. Life does not happen in this linear way like a novel would, like storytelling does with a 3 acts. Life is chaotic. It's like your dreams. It's a mess. But when you want to turn it into a memoir, you need to find an artificial structure to put over the events of your life so that they read in a logical, coherent way like a story for your reader. And that's why I think those questions of what did I want and what did I have to learn are so useful for memoir writers in particular, because it helps them shape their memoir. Now, the liberties come in. If you're going to continue to call it a memoir, the liberties you can take are things like, okay, you're going to make up conversations. Memoir is not journalism, and you're not, you aren't reporting people. So you're just going to stick to the emotional truth. You might change the setting of things. So much of life happens texting or on the phone, and that can be boring on the page. So maybe you put something on a hike.
Okay.
Or you want a sense of claustrophobia, so you have this conversation with someone in a car. So those are liberties you are entitled to take. Sometimes you can reorder events if it doesn't make a big difference, so that they build logically, one getting more extreme on top of the other, which maybe then forced you to come to a decision. So there's a little bit of artificiality you're putting on memoir to turn it into a story. And then I think what you're talking about a lot is what we sometimes call metafiction, which is this combination of writing from life but adding fictional elements, which has become very popular lately.
And what do you call that metafiction, or in the end it's fiction?
Yeah, but sometimes there's this sense of the author as an author being part of it too. And so it gets called metafiction. A lot of first-time authors' first books are very autobiographical. That's where many, many people start, including famous authors from the past, because it's an easier thing to access.
I have to ask you about AI. What are your thoughts on AI?
I'm still not sure what I think, but it was very disconcerting to learn that AI used my last book, A Master Plan for Rescue, as one of the books it was trained on.
Really?
There's a list, this went around with all my writer friends, where someone created a database and you could plug in the title of your book and you could see if it had been used. And it was this feeling like, oh my God, it took me 7 years to write this book. Who said you got to do that? So there's that. On the other hand, I actually use AI sometimes when I'm doing research. It can help you find the answer to a question very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And, as long as you're careful, because obviously it can hallucinate and get things wrong, but it also gets things very right. And sometimes it's just so helpful to just put in your question and not have to read through a bunch of things to get an answer. You get your answer. So I admit I've used it and I'm afraid of it.
Okay. So you're the jury's still out for you, or you're hesitant to take a stance on it right now.
Yeah, let's say that. I might feel a little more strongly if I was 20 and starting as a writer, because AI would have a lot more time to get really good.
Yeah. Janice, anything that I didn't ask you about that you want to mention before we wrap up?
I think you actually covered everything.
I thought of something, and you can just brush on this, but just take a moment to talk about publication and agents and that type of a thing.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's good. Okay, so I am a big believer in trying to find a traditional publisher. I know that many people end up self-publishing, but I think at least for the start, it is worth trying to go the traditional route. It's just that your work will be taken so much more seriously than self-publishing. There's still a lot of, they may even be misconceptions about self-publishing, but they're hard to get past. You do need to find an agent. So when you go out to find an agent, you need to make sure that your manuscript is finished. It is very rare these days now to sell a book before it's done, especially if it's memoir or fiction. So you need a completed manuscript. You should have had a developmental editor go over it and worked with them a bit on it, like some professional outside eyes. And then you're going to do your research. It's good if you have friends who have published who may introduce you to an agent. It's good if you go to a writers' conference, because you will often meet an agent, particularly writers' conferences that are juried, so not everybody gets in. Agents are more excited about going there because they feel they will meet a good writer.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to remember, as writers, we tend to think the agents are all powerful, but the thing is, they have no business unless they have writers. So in the end, they do need us.
Right.
Then you can do more research. So you go to the bookstore and you look at books that are similar to yours, and every writer thanks their agent in the acknowledgement.
Okay.
So unless their agent was horrible, and then you don't want them. And you look to see who their agent is, and then you look them up and you see what they accept. I mean, they all have guidelines online. There's also a thing called Publisher's Lunch, which you can subscribe to. And pretty much every day you get an email with like all the deals that have been made, who's selling what to what publisher. And you kind of go through that and say, okay, that book sounds a little bit like in the ballpark of mine. And here's this agent. Let me go look them up. And then you work very hard on a query letter, which is just one page. And you're not giving a synopsis. You are just telling just enough about your book to make somebody say, I want to read that.
Okay.
And then you send that out, and hopefully an agent asks for the full manuscript. And with any luck, they take you on. There may still be editing then. Agents will suggest edits. They'll suggest edits without guaranteeing to take you on. But if the edits make sense to you, do them. It's a gift, really. And then finally, they send it out to publishers. So that is sort of the traditional path to getting published.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. What was the book you said you're working on? Did you tell us?
I haven't. Yeah, it's my first contemporary novel. It is about rural Iowa, which turns out to be something I really don't know much about. I spent some time there. I interviewed many people, and at its heart, it's what big agriculture is doing to rural communities and our health and the environment. But hopefully, it's a rollicking good story, and won't sound like a soapbox book.
And how long until we might see it?
Oh, I think it's going to be 2, 3 years before I finish it. And then I'll send it off to my agent, and then probably there'll be some more edits. This is my what we call a polyphonic novel, a novel with multiple points of view.
Oh.
And so those questions that I mentioned have to be answered for each of my 4 very main characters.
Wow.
So that takes a little while.
You are incredibly ambitious, very inspirational, and extremely patient. Yes?
Well, writing a book, I think of as it's like a marriage. You better like what you're writing about and your characters.
Because you're in it for the long haul.
You're in it for the long haul.
Janice, thank you so much. This is such a pleasure. I'm so glad that you agreed to do this. I mean, I love talking to you, and you inspire me to write and to read and all that good stuff. So I thank you so much for that.
Oh, thank you. It was my pleasure.